Good evening. Welcome to York Festival of Ideas. My name is Penny Bickle. I'm a professor of funerary archaeology here at the University of York, and I will be chairing the event this evening. Thank you for joining us. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all here. Before I introduce you to your speaker this evening, I just need to run through some technical notes. So firstly, subtitles are available for this event. To turn these on or off, use the CC Show Captions button at the bottom of your screen. If you are watching this event live, you can ask questions using the Q&A button on your screen. This is available throughout the event, so questions can be posted at any time. And after Robert has finished speaking, we will come to you for questions. Please also remember that today's event is being recorded, so you will be able to watch again. Okay, so it is my very great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Robert Garland. Robert is the Roy D. and Margaret B. Worcester Professor Emeritus of Classics at the Colgate University in New York. He is also the author of many books on classical history, including The Greek Way of Death, Wandering Greeks, and Athens Burning. He has also recorded 6 courses for the Great Courses, most recently God Against the Gods. This evening, Robert is going to take us on a tour of death and the afterlife. So, Robert, over to you.
Thank you very much, Penny, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here. And I'm glad as well that death is alive and well, and that I was invited to be part of this wonderful festival. So thank you very much. Death is my first love in some ways, by which I mean that the dead fascinated me from a very early age, not in a lugubrious manner, I don't think, but just because there's something about the brevity of human life, the finiteness of human life, that makes life all the more precious, all the more exciting. And death is a reminder of that, I think. So it all began, so to speak, when I was about 8 years old, and I went to the British Museum with my mum and saw the mummies. And that really had a profound impact on me. I'm a strong believer that we should, in fact, not shield children from the idea of death, because I think it actually is a way to kind of enable children to understand how precious life is. And I was staring down at EA 32751, Egyptian Antiquities, that stands for Ginger, as he used to be called, but now for what are called ethical reasons, he's been given that name, such is life. And he was there in this case. I looked down at him, and he was all crouched in what we call the fetal position, possibly because there was a belief that he would come to life again in the tomb, and around him were jars and so forth that suggested that he might want to eat when he came back to life, etc. And staring down with my sticky fingers, looking into this glass case, I realized that there's not a lot between him and me in some ways. Well, there was about 3,400 years or more between us, but he looked so well preserved. He was desiccated. He was what we call a natural mummy, and that somehow made him seem almost alive. And that had an impact on me, I think, which I've always felt has enabled me to reach back in time. And the book that I wrote is all about reaching back in time and making common cause with our ancestors who faced exactly the same problems as we face in terms of life leading to death. And I would say were no more ignorant of what awaits us in the afterlife than indeed we are today. I don't think we've made much progress, despite all the religions and all the sentiments and beliefs that people have had in various religions. The undiscovered country from which no traveler returns is, I think, what all of us has to finally acknowledge, that we are very ignorant about death. But nonetheless, of course, we don't throw up our hands in despair. We do things, we have beliefs, whether we be Mesopotamians or Egyptians or Israelites, etc., etc., which give us some sort of sense that we are all in it together, because I think that's one of the great things about studying death and why I took on such a broad array of different cultures. I go back to the Neolithic period, even a little bit beyond, Mesolithic people, and try to work out what it is that sort of seems to be the common denominator of people's beliefs, people's ideas, and people's practices as well. Of course, there are many differences as well, but there is also a kind of universal, what I'm calling common denominator, I think, about how people face death and what they do about it. So I would say that death is a subject that one can not make light of necessarily, but I think not deal with in a particularly lugubrious manner. I'm not talking about grief. Grief is something quite separate, and I exclude grief from my book because I don't think it's in quite the same area of human experience as facing death and dealing with death, even though grief, of course, is all around that. But I'm more interested in beliefs and practices rather than in the emotions that death obviously inspires. So what is death? Death is not an event. It is a process. I mean, today we know that there are ways in which we can sort of almost bring people back from the dead through CPR, etc. And that was the case as well in antiquity. I think that the realization that we have today that death is a process, that it may extend, what brain death is different from the death that is of the lungs and so forth. That was something that was also held to be the case in antiquity, and the dead needed to be transported with loving hands, loving care to the next world. And that was something which came across to me when I was first studying the subject 40 years ago with my book, The Greek Way of Death, because just like The American Way of Death, Nancy Mitford, very famous book, death needs to be negotiated. It's not something that automatically and at a finite moment simply happens. And that realization, I say, goes back a long way as well. So death is a process. And we may think as well that it is not always easy to detect. In Greek mythology, hypnos, which means sleep, and thanatos, which means death, are brothers. Brothers because they are actually very similar to one another. And our word cemetery comes from the Greek verb kimame, which means I sleep. The sleeping place is what the cemetery therefore is. So there are many ways in which I think the ancients were somewhat perplexed by determining whether a person was alive or dead. And some of the stories about resurrection, I have to say, bear on that topic. And an author called Philostratus, who wrote about a holy man called Apollonius of Tyana, tells the story of once when he's going along and he sees a funeral taking place of a young girl, and he whispers something into her ear, and she seemingly resurrects. And Philostratus says, well, I actually think that probably he detected signs of life already in her. But this kind of story, I think, reflects upon the fact that in the ancient world, as in the modern world, particularly among the Victorians, of course, there was a sense that you couldn't necessarily tell whether a person was alive or dead. There was a book produced in, the 19th century by two authors, Tebb and Vollum, in which they state what are the methods by which you can actually work out whether somebody is alive or dead, one of which is tickling. If you tickle someone, it's very likely that there will be some movement. Another method is to apply a cigarette or something to the arm, etc. Anyway, they go through the various methods because the Victorians were paranoid about the possibility that when they were buried, they would suddenly find that they were awake inside the tomb, and what would they do to alert people outside? So I'm being a little bit frivolous here, but as I say, that is my approach, that I think that death actually is a subject that commits us all the more to life. And bringing a little bit of humor and lightheartedness to it, I think, is all to the good, I would say. I should admit that I do not believe that there is an afterlife. I'm quite direct about that. I think there are three big subjects that we as humans face. One is the meaning of life, which I'm working on. And the second one is whether God exists. And there I go with Protagoras, the sophist, who said about the gods, I neither know whether they exist or don't exist. The brevity of human life and the complexity of the subject make it impossible for us to know. But death, I think, is something that we all should think about, and which thinking about, I believe, intensifies the feeling of what it is to be alive. When Achilles, who is given two choices uniquely, whether he is going to live a long life and be forgotten when he dies, or a short life and be remembered forever, chooses the short life and to be remembered forever. But when he goes down to Hades and we meet him again in the Odyssey, then when Odysseus says to him, you have a great reputation and you're lord of the dead, and he says, I don't give a damn about any of that. I would rather be somebody who works for a dirt poor farmer than indeed lord of all the dead. And that was very Greek, I think, as well, that life is everything. Having said which, in the Oedipus at Colonus by Sophocles, the chorus says, best of all, not to have lived at all, next best to have gone down to Hades as quickly as possible. So the Greeks, I think, were a bit conflicted about that. The earliest record that we have of people thinking about death goes back to the Epic of Gilgamesh, Mesopotamian, Sumerian to be precise, which dates from about 2500 BCE. And Gilgamesh, the king, who is 2/3 immortal, goes on a journey to see whether he can become that extra third and fully immortal. But he fails, of course. And he fails the test by being unable to stay awake more than a few days, and has to concede that he is simply like everybody else. But the idea that there is an afterlife, that there is a possibility of something that outlasts the mere body, goes back a very long way. I'm absolutely sure of that. I don't know how far back it goes, but it certainly goes back tens of thousands of years. The earliest evidence, I think, for that would probably be about 50,000 years ago. In the Shanidar cave, which is in Iraq, there are burials which include a Neolithic burial where an item of an object had been placed with the deceased in order to suggest that maybe this will be useful in the world to come. It's obviously impossible to determine precisely why an object is placed in the grave, whether it is because it's very personal or whether it is because it will be of use. I mentioned Ginger, the EA 32751, having objects around him. Were these very personal items, or were they perhaps intended for his use in the world to come? So death has been a concern to people tens of thousands of years ago, maybe even 100,000 years ago. We can't be absolutely certain. There is evidence for a burial, perhaps deliberate, certainly of a large number of people, communal, 100,000 years ago in Spain, but it's possible that this was the result of a mud flow and that therefore all these people died together. That's the sort of problems that archaeologists run into when they go back in time and try to find evidence regarding beliefs where there is no literary evidence. We really are dependent on literary evidence in order to determine what people's views, beliefs, ideas were. So for that, we have to go back to the Egyptians. And the Egyptians I mentioned Ginger, start believing that there is an afterlife, certainly by around 3000 BC, I would say. And this is evidenced later by the fact that the Book of the Dead makes it very clear that the deceased will have to undergo a test, a negative confession, as it's called. And this is interesting because it's the Egyptians, not only who seek to preserve the body in the belief that preserving the body will enable the person to continue living an existence very similar to the one that they lived in this life. But in order to secure that kind of existence, they also have to pass a kind of postmortem test, which is often referred to as the negative confession. It's so called because the deceased had to say, I did not do this, I did not rob an orphan or harm this or that person. They do it before 42 assessors, and then their heart is weighed in a balance against the feather of truth, which is called ma'at. And if the heart is lighter than the feather of truth, then the deceased will be able to enter the field of reeds and enjoy eternity in a landscape very similar to the one that exists on Earth. If they don't, there is a nasty monster there, a hybrid creature with the jaws of a crocodile, the hind parts of a hippopotamus, and the mid part of a lion, and he comes and he gobbles up the deceased. But if the deceased pass the test, then Osiris, who is the god of the dead, will enable that person, as I say, to enter the field of reeds. And here we meet something that is not uncommon either, that it seems to be an afterlife that is particularly sort of constructed for the enjoyment of men. It's not clear that it is so organized for women as well, because the scenes that we have that decorate the tomb show the deceased perhaps hunting or enjoying a party, his wife perhaps sitting beside him, but it's a very male-oriented world view or afterworld view. The Egyptians were in love with life, and I would say that there is nothing necessarily mournful about the fact that they gave such attention to the afterlife. On the other hand, I always feel a great deal of sadness for them as well. Number one, think of the cost of having to mummify your corpse, then to buy a tomb, then to decorate it either with relief sculpture or with paintings, and then also to put all the objects in the tomb that you will need for the afterlife. I think it would have prevented you from taking that nice cruise down the Nile. And the expense that Egyptians paid on preparing for the afterlife was phenomenal. There is a coffin, a mummiform, anthropoid, I should say, coffin in the Brooklyn Museum for a man called Teti, and it says that it cost him the equivalent of what he would have needed to live for an entire year. So the Egyptians were committed to this kind of view that the dead needed, or they as the dead would need, enormous resources to be spent before they actually were able to enter the afterlife. And another thing to consider about the Egyptians is that there were so many things that could go wrong. And the worst, of course, was that their tomb would be broken into and robbed. And then as well, not just leaving the body, but often because amulets were placed around the body underneath the bandages, they would be stolen by the thieves as well. So the belief that the body had to be preserved came at great cost, as it were, to the Egyptians in terms of what they had to do and what their fears might have been. So death, I said, is a process, and in many cultures, there is a interim period during which the body or the deceased is betwixt and between. And a anthropologist, Arnold van Gennep, in 1919 produced a very significant book entitled Rites of Passage, and that's RITE, meaning the things that you do that enable a person, an individual, to pass from one state of being to another. And in the case of death, as in other rites of passage, there's a moment of separation from the living, a moment of transition during which the deceased is neither here nor there, so to speak, and then incorporation into the afterlife. And many ancient peoples would have observed this kind of tripartite structure to what they did on behalf of the dead. The Greeks, for instance, laid out the body in a ceremony called the prothesis, and the body was washed, and as it would have been in any tradition, really, including our own, and people would have visited, and they would have been in very close proximity to the dead, more so than we would allow today, in fact. And then the body would have been transferred to the place of burial within 24 hours, actually. That was the law that the Athenian lawgiver Solon imposed for whatever reason, whether it was for health reasons, as we might call it, or whether it was simply because it was not appropriate, that there should be more than that period of mourning for the deceased. The Romans did exactly the same and laid out the body again for a period of time, after which the funeral itself took place. In the case of the Romans, in the case of an aristocratic funeral, there was a ceremony that might end up in the Roman Forum. And I've always wondered, how could you book the Roman Forum in advance? You know, it's not a place that would normally have a lot of unattended free time, so to speak. But the deceased's ancestors, masks thereof, called imagines, word images, of course, would be worn by family members in a long line to indicate the sort of continuity of the family from many generations previously to the present. And of course, it goes without saying that one of the reasons why people do attend to funerals and make a lot of them is because there is a rupture that is caused by the disappearance, the death of the deceased. And this rupture has to be restored, or rather, the break has to be healed as a result. Funerals perform a number of services, I think. I always like something that Homer says when he's describing the funeral of Patroclus, Achilles' friend who was killed by Hector. And he says that the mourners mourned Patroclon prophasin, using Patroclus as an excuse. What they mean by that, what Homer means by that, is that, you know, when we mourn the deceased, and I said I wouldn't talk much about grief, but just on this one moment, we don't necessarily exclusively think about that deceased person. In fact, it can be something that just sort of brings up our common humanity and our sense of loss. And I think that's what Homer was understanding when he used that phrase. Sentimentality, restoring the rupture, acknowledging corporate grief, but also on behalf of the dead as well. A funeral is a way of giving the dead their due. And in the Greek case, it was very important. The lament was something very important. And the lament would go like, you know, how could you leave me? I'm so distressed. The dead wanted to know that they were missed, that they had caused a great deal of pain and sorrow to their survivors as well. So the funeral is for all those reasons. And I've mentioned as well that once you get to the afterlife, or just before you do so, you're in this betwixt and between place. And that is where, for instance, Patroclus is actually, after he has died, because Achilles refuses to bury him for many days. Such is his intense grief. And eventually he appears to Achilles in a dream and says to him, bury me so that I can pass through the gates of Hades. And the belief in Hades, of course, was that in order to get there, you had to pass across the river Styx. And in order to cross the river Styx, you had to be ferried across by Charon, the ferryman of the dead. So that too seems to suggest to me that there is a sort of an interim period before the dead actually reach the afterlife. Other beliefs in the Odyssey about the afterlife, and that's a subject that I'd like to sort of now turn to. Our earliest ideas, probably, let's say Mesopotamian, a place called Ker, which is for everybody. No distinction made between good or bad, or even perhaps between people of a higher social level from people who are lower down. All of them are consigned to the same single place. That was also the case with the Greek Hades as well, with the exception of three particularly bad felons. The most famous one is perhaps Tantalus. Tantalus had served up his son Pelops to the gods to test whether they were aware that they were eating human flesh, and so he was punished in the way that we recall by the word tantalize, which is to say that food receded from him as he went to eat it, and so did drink as he went to search for that as well down in Hades. But those are the only three people who are punished in the afterlife. Everybody else ends up in exactly the same place. Good, bad, indifferent, whatever it might be. And also a place of darkness where there doesn't seem to be much going on. So much cut off from the world above that when Odysseus arrives down there, everybody clambers around to drink the blood, which restores the senses, the sensory perceptions, the intellectual awareness of the dead, and they are all eager to hear knowledge of the world above. That is one of the beliefs that I think is most painful and poignant, really, about the afterlife, that you are completely cut off from any knowledge of what is going on in the world above. In later times, the Greeks rejected that idea, and particularly in Athens in the 5th century, it became very common to depict the dead and the living in a handshake motif. Dexiosis, it's called, where the dead and the living are either reuniting in the afterlife or they're parting in this world, but there's a sense of continuity and a sense that this will be not a final separation. In fact, that is a belief that is most profoundly held today by people as well, that they will be reunited with their families in the world to come, and also as well with their pets. I was in Stowe Church a few weeks ago, and I noticed that there were prayers left. And one of the prayers very touchingly read, "Please God, I do hope that good dogs go to heaven." And it was signed by a little dog. That's to say, he was a Scottie or something like that. And that belief that we will not be separated off from our loved ones. I mean, if heaven is anything, it's got to mean that, has it not? I mean, there's no point in being in heaven if you don't actually reunite with the people you've loved on earth. Although I do recall in a book once that it showed the husband there and a wife in a separate headstone and another wife in a separate headstone, and underneath the author Emily Vermeulen had written "Trouble in Heaven." Which of the wives was going to be the wife in the afterlife, so to speak? The idea of the afterlife is, of course, one where religion has, I won't say invaded, but made a huge impact in how we look at what we might be expecting in the afterlife. Already by the time of Virgil in the first century, end of the first century BC, beginning of the first century CE, it's clear that Virgil is having ideas that sort of anticipate Christianity, one might say, because he has extended the different kinds of categories of dead who will be punished in the afterlife. And he also interestingly talks about the need to rid oneself in the afterlife of the old sin, as it might be translated. An idea very similar, in fact, to the Christian belief in purgatory, a place where you go for a period of time in order to be purged of your sins. Also, interestingly, from Virgil's perspective, the unborn also live in his underworld, awaiting to be summoned. And when Aeneas goes down there, he has a vision of all the descendants who will make Rome great. So the afterlife, of course, features prominently in Christianity, although I think it's important to note that there is really no evidence of the idea that eternal punishment is what is awaiting the wicked and so forth, nor is there any belief in a postmortem judgment, not in the words that we see that Jesus utters in the Gospels. On the contrary, what will happen when we die is that there will be a separation between the good and the bad, but this will happen, as it were, automatically and without any judgment of all our wickednesses or indeed all the good things that we've done. The belief in an afterlife that is one of terrible punishment is much more a medieval idea, which particularly takes root at the Council of Florence in 1438, when it is stated quite categorically that Catholics will go to heaven, but non-Catholics, including Jews, heretics, schismatics, etc., will automatically go to hell. It's an idea that takes root much later than the first century of the Christian movement, which I think is very interesting. It's not something that gets embedded. Heaven, yes, is an idea that obviously takes root there, but not so much a belief in a post-mortem judgment. And in fact, when Jesus is on the cross, he says to the good, repentant thief, today you will be with me in paradise. He doesn't say, well, once you've gone through your examination, which I'm sure you're going to pass, then, we'll be together. No, it seems to be happening automatically. So, question that I always wonder, what will be your social status in the afterlife? We don't know anything about that in any religion, really, other than the belief I think that most people have is that they'll be, if they're wealthy in this life, they'll be wealthy in the next life. Will you have to work in the afterlife? Egyptians certainly thought that you would have to. And for that reason, they placed little figures called shabtis with the dead. Shabtis means answerers, and the little answerer would be able to do the work of whatever the deceased was asked to do, such as, irrigation or cleaning out dirty fields from mud and sludge and everything else that might have collected there. Do you have sex in the afterlife? Fascinating question. Jesus gets asked this question. Will marriages still exist? And he's somewhat, I have to say, Delphic in his answer, not making it very clear whether he believed that or not. I go with the Etruscans. There's a wonderful sarcophagus in the Boston Museum of Fine Art, which shows a couple embracing. And it's very clear that they are either about to make love or they have made love. What could be a more beautiful way to spend the afterlife, I think. When you want to get rid of the body, there's a limited number of ways you can do that. You can bury it, you can burn it, you can leave it just to be picked at by beasts and vultures and so forth, or you can eat it. That's about the lot from the point of view of the ancients. Today, there are one or two more methods. Cryogenics, for instance, suggests that you might be able, if you have the money to put down, come back in the next life, be resurrected physically, literally speaking, with the same body and the same brain. But thus far, there is no actual method to, though you can be preserved, to actually bring you back intellectually, mentally, your brain. Another possibility is to send your ashes into space, which some people like to do, to become one literally with the universe. So I'd like to end, I think I'm just about on time, with a couple of thoughts about things that we learn about death in a general way. I would note that an enormous amount of money is spent on death globally. I looked this up a few days ago. 140 billion pounds is spent on the global death industry. And of course, a lot of work is being made, tended to, in trying to find ways in which to extend human life. We have, of course, been increasing in longevity. Worth remembering that in the ancient world, you would be lucky to survive if you were a woman into your early 30s and a man into your mid 40s. That had a tremendous impact, I think, upon the way that people dealt with life itself, knowing that death could carry you off at any moment. And death was very much more visible than it is today, of course, because monuments to death were more permanent than residences were. But even today, as we see, death is big money for the death industry. So, some general considerations about what is true, I think, and what my study really taught me. That the dead are needy for attention. They were then, they are today, I think. We still feel that we want to give to the dead, even if it's only placing flowers on the tomb. And also, secondly, most importantly, it is important to honor the dead. To be disrespectful to the dead is going against common humanity. It was the case in antiquity, even though there were terrible examples of people showing degrading the dead, like Achilles pulling the body of Patroclus around the walls of Troy attached to his chariot. But nonetheless, that is seen as inhumane and is to today. And a general belief that I don't hold, as I've said, that what we do in this life affects how we will be placed in the world to come. So, what do we learn from death? Number one, humility. We are all in the same boat, whether we're Ramesses II or whether we're just the poorest person on earth. And I think remembering that is something that helps us to unite as a race, as humans. For heaven's sake, we are all going to die. Secondly, it's that we all find it difficult to believe that it's lights out, that we will just simply disappear. And I acknowledge that. And it's not something that one dismisses as an aberration or stupid or anything like that. To actually believe that the universe is going to carry on without me, how can I think that? Well, I do my best to think that, I have to say. The universe does not need me. I know that. Also, human imagination is limited. Throughout centuries, millennia, people have come up with basically the same kind of ideas about what death is all about and how they are going to negotiate dealing with death on behalf of their loved ones. And illogicality as well. You know, you can believe that the dead go to heaven, but you still want to do something at the tomb. And finally, I would say carpe diem. Make the best of life. Pluck the day. It's all we've got, and we don't know what tomorrow will hold. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. That's a wonderful way to finish that really fascinating tour through death in the classical world and far beyond as well. So thank you. So We're now going to have time for questions from the audience. So if you're out there, please do type your questions into the Q&A function, and I'll do my best to moderate those and put those to Robert. But while you get your thinking caps on and your fingers typing, I have a question. So Robert, you've spent your entire career studying death in the classical world. What gave you the idea to give us this handbook of what to expect when we pass away or after death? What was the kind of spark of inspiration for this volume?
Well, if I may just say, Penny, that I didn't spend my entire life academically thinking about death. It's odd. I had a sort of a 35-year, 36-year gap in between when I sort of thought of other things. But yes, I mean, I think that what brought me back to it was I've become increasingly interested, although trained as a classicist in Greek history. I started thinking, well, I'm interested in other places, peoples, and so on. And what better subject than death to look at how this was treated by all these different peoples? I mean, I love going back in time. I love trying to imagine what it would have been like as a Mesopotamian, as an Egyptian, as a Etruscan, or whatever it might be, facing their own set of problems and issues. And so that was a very important part of it. It was intended to bring in these other interests that I had, and I have to confess, I didn't know a lot about some of them before I started, and maybe I still don't, but nonetheless I felt I knew enough to be able to sort of say, oh my gosh, that's awfully similar. And the other thing about the book that when I say, what to expect when you die, what I mean by that is that I wanted to, if I could, enable the reader to sort of also put themselves in the shoes, the sandals, as I like to say, of ancient peoples, and to realize, that we're just, like the Sistine Chapel, the fingers are coming across, because we are so close to that, if we like to just acknowledge it. And I do think that they have something to tell us, even if it's that, their lives were so much more difficult than ours are, and their lives so much shorter. And they faced these problems with, I think, tremendous courage. I have enormous respect for the ancients, I have to say. They were fearless, and they dealt with pain and suffering and everything else that we would, not find so easy to deal with. What would we do without indoor heating and so forth?
Yeah, yes, quite. Well, that is a wonderful starting point. There are lots of questions coming in, so I'm going to turn now to the audience questions. Um, so I'm just going to work my way through the list in the order that they came in. So the first question is from an anonymous attendee. Says, do modern day or recent foragers believe in an afterlife? So that was quite early on in the presentation. You talked about kind of some of the earliest evidence. Here, someone asking, do modern day foragers, hunter gatherers, believe in an afterlife?
Well, I think, I mean, that's a very specific question, and I have to confess that I'm not familiar with the belief system of hunter-gatherers today. I mean, I think that the one of the things that, if I may refer back, if the questioner doesn't mind this, um, in hunter-gathering societies, you have to leave the dead behind, and I think that makes a big difference to how you think about death. Now, you might believe, of course, that if you leave the dead behind, that, they get up and they lead their lives, resurrect, or whatever it might be. But I do think that when sedentism became part of the human experience, when people settled in places, and then they had a very different relationship with the dead. And in early times, of course, we know from Catalhuyuk and other places that they actually buried the dead inside the home, perhaps selectively, but nonetheless, in order to sort of maintain that relationship. And in China today, of course, ancestor worship with some kind of shrine in the home was very important. So, without literary evidence, or even speaking to hunter-gatherers today, I think it's very difficult. But I do think that there, as I say, that there was this big difference that enabled people then to think, okay, we need to do something for the dead, and the dead are now around us, and that means that we have a different relationship with the dead. So I think that's about as far as I can go with that very interesting question.
Yeah, it's a good question. Um, Karen B says, great presentation, thank you. And asked a question about near-death experiences. So do you have any opinion about it, Robert? And what did the classical world think about near-death experiences?
Well, I think that, I mean, that's a really interesting. I'm going to say this all the way, I know, but it's a very interesting question, and I'm not an expert on that by any means. I don't know whether medical science will be able to determine whether these visions and the bright light and the tunnel and so forth are actually something that the brain sort of manufactures within itself. But what I can say is that yes, these are recorded from antiquity. The most famous example occurs in Plato's Republic, where the Pamphylian, the Pamphylian, is dies, it seems, and then comes back to life several days later and declares that he has gone to the underworld and has witnessed that there is a bifurcated life for the good and the not so good, and he describes it. And this raises all sorts of interesting questions. It's very specific, his name. He's killed in warfare, or he's thought to have died in a war, and he comes back to life. Now, there's no reason. I'm a natural skeptic, but I think there's every likelihood that this was based on some kind of record from antiquity. It's not the only example, by the way, but it's the most famous example. And because it occurs in Plato, and Plato describes it at some length, it deserves our attention. So, although having declared myself, I can't say that that's what NDE means, that people are sort of entering another world and then they're brought back. But certainly something happens to the brain. Yes, I think that is medically determined, that causes these visions and so forth to take place, so that there is certainly something biological that is going on, um, which may be as well experienced.
Good, good. It's a good question. That was a great answer. Thank you. So next, Stuart asks, what do you think about Pierre de Chagrin's concept death and mortality, that we're not humans having a spiritual experience, but spirits having a human experience?
Well, if I say that's a lovely question. I mean, that's a very philosophical question, of course. I don't know that I could adequately do justice to it in the space of just a trivial sentence or two. But I think that, yes, I mean, of course, how do I know that anything exists other than in my mind? You know, this is such a profound question, of course. I mean, I'm reminded of what Dr. Johnson said when he was given a similar sort of question. He said, the stone, does the stone exist? And he kicks it and he said, yes, of course it exists. But I don't know. I mean, honestly, to do justice to this question, other than to say that it occurs to me, yes, is life or the spirit world, which is it that's real, really? And what are we experiencing at this moment? I'm not a philosopher, but I am, I think, able to sort of identify with what the question is meaning. And there is no answer to it. I mean, we are profoundly in a place of uncertainty in human experience, let alone when we start thinking about the afterlife. And how do we know that everything isn't of our own imagining? You're imagining, more likely, I think. So I wish I could engage with that question at great length, but I feel that I should probably not try to say anything more.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really interesting question to think about. One of the things that struck me about the question was also you've spoke a lot about sort of classical beliefs of the afterlife, but there's also pre-life and beliefs about pre-life that we know people globally have very different beliefs about. And I think that question kind of also gets at, where did and a question for you, where do the sort of classical concept of birth come in? Are do people exist pre-birth, or is are they? I know there are some cultures around the world for whom people are reincarnated, and so it's not your first time on Earth. Whereas for the classical world, there may be an afterlife, but was there that kind of sense of reincarnation, or something else taking place?
Well, you get it. I won't go to too much length of that, but yes, I mean, you get into you mentioned, when does life begin issue. And that was something that the ancients concern themselves with, as, the Greeks were always, every question that you could possibly ask today was asked in antiquity. And Aristotle actually said that life begins with aesthesis, with perception. When the embryo has some sense of perception, then it is life. I mean, obviously, it's a very charged question for us today, but one nonetheless that has significance as well, was found to be something that people were thinking about. And I mentioned as well that Virgil, saw the when down in Hades, the unborn were there. He sees the whole cavalcade of people who are going to be born. So life and death are kind of connected as well in Virgil's imagination, which I think is really very interesting.
Yeah, very interesting. Okay, so we've got a few more questions to go, so I'll keep us going. Someone says wonderfully, I could listen to Robert all day. Thank you so much, which is very nice to hear. Um,
Thank you.
and they wanted to ask, what's the most interesting or unusual ritual that you've learnt about?
Oh, well, yes, and we were talking about this, I think, before, and I mentioned, when you want to know when death has actually occurred, which it's still an issue. I was very touched by the Zoroastrian Sagdid ceremony, whereby, somebody looks as though they're dead, but are they really dead? So a dog is brought in, and the dog is led around the corpse. And if the dog, I don't know what the dog does, by the way, whether it barks, it pricks up its ears, or it snaps, whatever it does, this is seen as a way to determine whether death has occurred. And so, because I love dogs, I kind of think of that particular ceremony, which has all the hallmarks of being something very, very sort of kind of amateurish. But the fact that it is ingrained in Zoroastrianism gives it the status of something really very important. And who knows if it isn't actually rather good way. I mean, dogs have, this is another fascinating question, of course, dogs do seem to have some sort of sense of things that goes beyond the normal, something kind of almost paranormal. And in the Odyssey, for instance, the dogs recognize Athena, the goddess, in the hut of Eumaeus, because they are very alert to these other things that humans don't quite catch up on. So I'll go with the Sagdid ceremony.
Yeah, that's a really wonderful choice. Thank you so much. So moving on, the next question again, sadly is anonymous, but it says, when did people first use the phrase passing? So they say they dislike this expression and think it would be much better if we were more open to talk about death and dying. So when did people first use passing, if you know that, or a response to that about being more open about death and dying?
I 100% agree with this. And it's particularly pronounced in America, and I think it's actually replaced passing away, which makes it even worse. To pass away is okay, away, but when you cut off away and you just say passing, well, what that's really etiolated it, and it's a euphemism that I don't care for. I don't know when that came in. I don't remember it being used when I was, I don't know, in my 30s, 40s, whatever. Um, I think it's fairly recent. I would have to look that up, but it seems to have been gathering a pace. And, I swear, I had this same conversation with somebody just 2 weeks ago, and she too was objecting to the fact that people could not speak directly about death. And I think this is, not only is it unfortunate, it's almost disrespectful, I think. This is what has happened. Let's face it. Why can't we acknowledge that death has occurred? Um, just to go on a little bit about this, in the ancient world, all the roads leading out of the cities in the Greco-Roman world were lined with tombs. The reason being that death is polluting, and so you cannot have death inside. You can have dead bodies inside the city, but it meant that you were going down the road out of the city of Rome, out of Athens, and you saw these tombs, and you were reminded of death itself. And that to me is important. It's respectful, but it's also acknowledging our human identity. So, although I can't answer the question in terms of when precisely, but I think it's fairly recent. And as I say, it's certainly got a hold in America where I live, and passing seems to have even begun to replace passing away. So I'm 100% behind the fact that we should acknowledge death as death.
Thank you, Robert. So the next question comes from Ian, who believes in your non-belief in an afterlife, agrees with your non-belief in afterlife, and says, but for those who do believe in an afterlife, then why is suicide disapproved of, since it is bringing the afterlife sooner? And I guess that opens another question of in your survey of how people are responding, are there different responses to suicide, or is it always kind of seen as something to be disapproved of?
Yes. Suicide is a very interesting question, of course. I didn't include it in the book because I was sort of looking at sort of more mainstream ideas, but I have looked at suicide in the past, and as we would expect, there are kind of contrary views about it. It, one big question is, was it as prevalent in the ancient world as it is today? Um, Certainly, Plato objects to suicide on, you know, religio-philosophical grounds. Um, but we hear about, we hear a lot about suicide. We know that there were laws against it, for instance. How universal those laws were is impossible to tell. We hear of a suicide sort of frenzy among young girls as well. Um, but it's Christianity, of course, that introduces the total ban on suicide. In the Roman world, of course, it was noble. If a Roman general was defeated or likely to be, hauled into prison or something like that, then the courageous thing was to fall upon his sword. So the ancients did differentiate between whether you died, took your own life because, for instance, you were suffering from illness, terminal illness. There is a philosopher, I cannot remember his name, who he lived to be 100, and he stubbed his toe and he went home and he said, well, that's it. And he committed suicide. And he was regarded, I think, as rightly having taken things into account and decided that this was the right thing to do. So it would have depended on why you committed suicide. Um, and again, there's sort of so much to say on this subject, methods of suicide and so forth, but I won't go into all that. So that would be the main thought that I would have on this subject, that although, as I say, there were laws against suicide, it did depend on the reasons for it. In Virgil's Aeneid, suicides are a separate category of the underworld as well. And of course, Dido commits suicide, but she does so for love as well. And I think Virgil doesn't condemn her for that reason at all.
Yeah, fascinating topic. Probably there's a whole book on that.
Definitely, there have been books written on it. Yes, in the ancient world.
I
Yes,
think we have
because
time
many,
for
many examples of it.
many examples, yeah. There is, we have time for one more question just before we wrap up, which is, again from someone anonymous saying, how much ritual cannibalism of the deceased was practiced in the ancient world? So you mentioned there were certain ways of dealing with the dead body. One of them was eating them. Are there any examples from the antiquity of practicing cannibalism?
Lovely question. This enables me to end on a note which I'm very fond of. A story in Herodotus told about the Persian king Darius, who conducts a anthropological experiment. He has an Indian tribe from the subcontinent of India called the Kaliatii, and he has Greeks. And he says to the Kaliatii, what would it take for you to burn your dead? And they throw up their arms in despair. Why? Because fire is sacred. Okay. And then he says to the Greeks, what would it do to you to eat your dead? And they throw up their hands in despair as well. The point being that the Greeks burn their dead, the Kaliatii eat their dead. So there is indeed evidence for endocannibalism in the ancient world. And Herodotus, who is fascinated by all kinds of oddities like this, is a wonderful source for that. So I always love that story because it's showing, it's a good note to end on in a way that, although there are many similarities, universals, we might say, about the way people treat death, there are also interesting singularities as well, and endocannibalism is one of them.
Robert, thank you so much, especially for that fascinating and thought-provoking talk. And thank you as well for answering so many great questions from our audience members. That was really a wonderful, different tour through the ancient world. To the audience, thank you so much for attending today's event. Be sure to check out what else is coming up in the festival programme. And I just want to leave you firstly with a reminder that the recording of this event will be available on the festival's York Ideas YouTube channel, which can be accessed from the Watch Again section of the festival, and you'll be contacted by email when the video is available to view. Also, if you would like a copy, to purchase a copy of Robert's wonderful book, What to Expect When You're Dead, I've read it and it really is a wonderful exploration of death and very entertaining. Copies are available from our partner bookseller, Fox Lane Books, which can be found all one word, foxlanebooks.co.uk. Thank you again to everybody and join us for more events in this year's Festival of Ideas.